Gabrielle Glaser. You are a New York Times best-selling author and journalist, and you like to challenge conventional wisdom on subjects that touches people's life. You like to examine how accepted practices in one era have unexpected and devastating consequences in years to follow. And today we're here to speak about your latest book, American Baby, a mother, a child, and the shadow story of adoption. Gabrielle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So this is a touchy subject. It's more or less like a taboo adoption, what people do with their private life. I mean, not everyone have the perfect iconic life of getting married, having a baby, and then sending them to school. Some people have sex before marriage, and sometimes they don't want to show that off. Oh my God. And then of course this happened in another era in the 1950s. The book or the characters in this book, their story takes place in that time frame, and it's just extremely interesting. I wonder if we could start talking about you. Who are you? How do you become a journalist? And then I see different topics of your writing. You delve into things that, as you said, touches people's life and challenge unconventional wisdom. So I wonder why you decided to go into that vein.
I've always loved stories. I've always loved storytelling. And when I was a little girl, being that you are in Montreal, I'll tell you this story. I had a Canadian grandfather who, when I was very small, used to tell me bedtime stories about how he'd grown up in Alberta and how he'd been eaten by bears, how he had been swallowed by bears, how he met the character called Sasquatch. Do you know who Sasquatch is? Okay, yes. So, and as a child, I was absolutely riveted by his stories. And for quite a long time, I believed them. I believed he used to speak in different accents and different languages. And I believed that he was fluent in all of those languages. And I realized from a very, very small age, the power of stories and how they can transport you. And if they're fiction, it's one thing and it's wonderful. If they're nonfiction, that's another realm. But nobody has actually asked me that question before, Alain, so I'm happy to answer it. And I think from as I said, from a very young age, I understood the transporting power of storytelling.
Okay, so you discovered this, and how does that guide your stories and then the beginning of your career as a journalist and then later as an author?
I went to college and studied Latin. I studied history, and then I studied Latin American history. I lived in Brazil for some time. I lived in Haiti for some time doing research, and I had hoped to become an historian of Brazilian history. That didn't happen. I wound up getting a job as an assistant at the New York Times in the Washington Bureau. And my boss, the man who hired me, said, I don't think your personality is really suited for spending time in archives. Why don't you try journalism for a year? I think you're going to like it. And I did. And I didn't ever really look back. And it took me a while to sort of find what it was I wanted to cover. You know, when you're a young journalist, you cover whatever is put ahead of you. And I lived in Baltimore, and I covered all sorts of things that happened in the 1980s. There was a crack epidemic that was really rampant in American cities at the time. I covered the harvests of mollusks on the Chesapeake Bay. And over time, I developed a sense, you get exposed to everything as a young journalist. And over time, I understood that what I really wanted to do was go back to that storytelling aspect of journalism? What was it? You know, people weren't getting eaten by bears. It's sort of hard to cover that. And people who get eaten by bears who survive. That was my grandfather's story, of course. But the compelling elements of our experience here on Earth was something that I wanted to try to share.
And you focus on nonfiction stories, and you focus on challenging the conventional wisdom. Can you share with us some of your previous titles and just like one line of what are they about?
One of my most recent book before American Baby was a book called Her Best Kept Secret: Why Women Drink and How They Regain Control. And it was a book that really examined what was behind a huge drive in a spike in women's drinking, what made them want to drink, why. I mean, the conventional wisdom is sort of, well, they're the conventional wisdom about people who drink too much is that there's something wrong with them, that they're undisciplined, that they lack control. There are a lot of myths we have about that. So I explored that. I explored the typical prescriptive that we use in North America for people who drink too much, which is Alcoholics Anonymous. And I found that while it's widely accepted in our popular culture to think that that is the solution for everybody, in fact, for women, it's really not terribly effective, and in some ways can be damaging. So I spent a lot of time in that sphere of looking at what helps people when they develop addiction and how they can get better. And instead of the narrative that we have that if you drink too much, it's because you're powerless over alcohol. And if you go to a 12-step program, you're just going to be better. That helps some people, but certainly not the majority of people who try it. So that was my previous, I spent quite a few years delving into that world and trying to find ways that I could convey in layman's terms how people could get help.
So on your day-to-day life, you work as a journalist, and then you keep your ear open to see what kind of stories you could capture and share with us. Is that what you do? Yes,
actually, that you just put it exactly the way it is. But with this story, with the story of American Baby, it has a very long history with me. I was a newspaper reporter at the Oregonian in Portland in the early 2000s. I'm from Oregon, and I was at my home state paper, and I covered adoption and reproductive technology. Oregon is a very open state, and at the time, it was one of the pioneering places where people could have open adoptions. There was a lot of surrogacy that was happening at the time. So I covered adoption and the different ways in which people put their families together as a beat. And as a result of that coverage, I learned about the story of David Rosenberg. It was 2007, and a pitch for the story about this man, David, who was a pillar of his community, beloved in town. He wore many different hats. He was a cantor at a respected large synagogue. He also was a co-founder of a pizza chain, a really upscale pizza chain. And he was adopted, and he was getting a kidney donation from a friend. And the business reporter to whom the story had been referred wasn't able to cover it, but he forwarded it to me and said, "This has your name on it." He knew I was Jewish. The business reporter was also Jewish. He knew that I would find a connection to this story. So in 2007, I met David at a dialysis center in Portland, and I was a little astonished because have you ever been to a dialysis center?
No.
It's a very intimate place. People who are undergoing dialysis are sitting in a recliner, and there are these really loud machines that are it's cacophonous, really. You can hardly hear yourself think. And you see these, I don't know, I'm sorry for that pinging. I need to figure out how to undo it. You see people with their tethered to tubes that are taking out blood that needs to be cleaned on with one, and then the machine is doing the cleaning, and the clean blood is going back into another, into another port. And it's just, it's really at the intersection of life and death.
Wow.
And so here was this man I was meeting for the first time. And he said, "Oh, come meet me at the dialysis center." And I was sort of taken aback. "Are you sure you want me to do that?" And he said, "No." He was a multitasker. He said, "I'm stuck here 3 hours, 3 times a week. So it's not like I could be out doing errands. Come meet me here." So I did. And easily within 10 or 20 minutes of sitting down, he told me that while the story was really moving, it was about this kidney donation, as I said, that he was receiving from a close friend in his religious community. He hoped that the story would go viral and that his birth mother would see it. It was 2007, as I said, and things were beginning to go viral. YouTube had debuted. I don't think maybe Facebook had started, but I don't think many of us were on it yet. And he told me that he hoped that his birth mother would see the story and recognize him as her son. Mm-hmm. And while he was very clear about his aims, he wasn't looking for a new family. He loved his adoptive parents, the Rosenbergs, but he really hoped that he would be able to learn more medical information for his children.
Right.
Go ahead.
Can you tell us what's the difference between open adoption and closed adoption? I have never considered adoption, so I don't know what was one or the other.
So closed adoptions were something that existed basically from the 1920s and 30s, starting in the 1920s and 30s in this country and beyond, through the late 1970s, maybe even beyond. And what it was is that if a woman got pregnant out of wedlock and didn't get married, she was forced by society, by her parents, by her religious community, and in many cases the law, to surrender the child she had born out of wedlock. In many states, including New York State, where American Baby takes place, it was actually a criminal act to have premarital sex.
Can you say that again?
I will say that again. It was a criminal act for girls to have premarital sex until 1971. And those laws were rooted in 19th century laws that were called Wayward Minor Acts. So, and those laws encompassed every single transgression, from being rude to your parents, from being out too late, and on through having sex as an unmarried teenager. And girls were sometimes prosecuted for that terrible crime.
Are you referring to maybe people in a higher social class? Because, I mean, I can see this going on all the time through history, but only be of importance if you want to maintain certain status of reputation in society.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. But in the early 20th century, there were social reformers who actually these laws started in the late 19th century. There were social reformers who thought that they could police women's bodies. And certainly if you had access to the correct lawyer and connections, you were not going to be entrapped by this one criminal statute. But yes, they did threaten young women and did prosecute them for this for this, act of biology, and often put them in juvenile detention and juvenile, reformatory schools. So, but that's just a small thread of this story. So in the years after World War II, there was a demand in the United States, actually throughout North America, for women who had been completely courageous members of the war effort, working in munitions plants, driving semi-trucks, working in canneries, learning to fly planes, going to universities so they could help the nation win the war against the Nazis. And after that was over, those same heroic women were forced to return to the hearth. They were expected to raise children, to get first of all, to get married, and to raise large families. And as part of another political objective, which was to somehow outnumber, after World War II, our alliances shifted, and people thought that we were in a battle for democracy. Americans believed that they were in a battle for this freedom, this, way of liberty, life, liberty, and happiness, except for women. So women were expected to have, and people of color, by all means, people of color were completely excluded from that, the rights that many white men were afforded, that most white men were afforded. But back to the question you had, women were expected to have these large families. And if you couldn't have a large family, if you were unable to conceive, if you and your spouse were by some means, infertile, the only way for you to achieve family building was to be able to adopt. And in those same years after the war, there were many other social changes that were afoot. And one was that the sexual revolution was simmering. Men who had been in the service overseas came back sexually experienced, and they were very unlikely to want to remain celibate with their girlfriends. And yet there was no birth control, even for married couples in many states. That was against the law until a Supreme Court decision, in 1965, that legalized it. There was certainly no abortion. That was illegal in this country in most states until 1973. And of course, there was no sex education. At the same time, young people had space and time. There were new mechanical advantages that allowed young people to have fewer chores. A vacuum cleaner sucked up what, it was much less work to have your child help clean the house when there was a vacuum cleaner involved and a power mower than if it took to use a push mower or a broom. So young people, adolescents had more time, they had more space, they had private bedrooms, they had rec rooms, and most importantly, it was the beginning of automobile culture, and they had the backseat of the family Buick. So the number of young women who got pregnant skyrocketed. It tripled between the 1940s and the late 1960s. And because there was a new middle class to aspire to, these girls got sent away it was a shameful secret that the young women got pregnant. Their families sent them away out of shame, especially out of shame. And they went to maternity homes where they lived out their pregnancies in secret. They had to give birth alone. And then they were told, you'll forget about this. We're going to take the baby and make like it never happened, and everything's going to turn out fine. We're going to give the baby to a married couple, and the laws at the time actually sealed the original identity of that child born to the unwed mother, so that only state officials and some social workers actually were able to pick up the paper and see, okay, David Rosenberg was actually born Stephen Mark Erle, the name that his birth mother, Margaret Erle Katz, had given him at birth. But because those records were secret, except to the people in power, David and millions of other adoptees had no idea about their original identities, their original families. And they were given an amended birth certificate that listed their adoptive name and their adoptive parents as the original mother and father.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
It's a lot. It's a lot.
Wow. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and over time, you asked about what's the difference between open adoption and closed adoption. So over time, this cruel system, and it was cruel, and it remains cruel, and its legacy remains cruel. Over time, this system, the tragedies of this system became very apparent. And adoption itself began to change and allowed birth mothers, if they were unable to be able to raise their children on their own, or lacked the support, or had maybe a medical problem or a psychological problem that, you know, got in the way of their being able to mother their child, they then were able to choose, starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the system evolved to allow birth mothers to choose the parents with whom they would place their children. And while that's certainly preferable to closed adoption, oftentimes the birth mothers have an ongoing relationship with the adoptive family and their child. It's still, adoption begins with loss. It's really important to acknowledge that being severed from your blood kin is a loss, no matter how it starts, and how it ends. If it ends happily, it's still painful not to have that tie.
So David, he assumes that he was rejected by his mother, and of course he discovered later on that that was not the case. So we don't want to tell the whole story, but can you give us more or less what happened? What was the reaction of David when he finds out that he was not rejected?
So David took a DNA test in 2014 that ultimately very swiftly led him to his birth mother. He connected with a distant relative who was able to locate Margaret, who had been searching for David all of his life, praying, hoping. Of course, she never forgot him. She had married his birth father, had 3 more siblings, and was turned away by the adoption agency when she tried to leave her contact information once he was an adult, and had really sort of given up hope of ever finding him. But they did find each other 3 months before David died of some of the very illnesses about which Margaret had tried to warn him his whole life. So for David, who had always believed that he'd been an inconvenience to his mother, that he'd been given up, that he had somehow stood in the way of her having what they called a better life, he learned as he was dying that in fact he had been conceived in love. He had been loved, he had been wanted, and that changed how he felt about, I wasn't there at the time, but from what his family says, from what his friends say, it upended his own personal narrative to know that he had been loved and wanted.
Do you know if David's families or the millions of David's families ever realize that they have committed a mistake?
How do you say committed a mistake?
Well, I mean, obviously, Margaret's mother and father, they forced her to have this adoption. And in retrospect, that seems like a horrible thing to do. She probably, we know that she would have loved to have this baby. So in retrospect, now, I don't know, X amount of years later, do they wish they wouldn't have acted that way? Do they recognize that as a mistake or not? Do they think that was the proper thing to do at that moment of time?
I can't answer that because Margaret's parents and George's parents died. And they never, ever, ever spoke again about their phantom grandson. And in fact, George and Margaret didn't speak very often about their lost son. Did the grandparents who held the power recognize this as a mistake? In my heart, I'd like to think so, but that expression of those feelings of regret never, as far as I know, never made their way out of anyone's mouth. So I do know that, some of my adoptee rights friends have met who are younger than David, have met their birth grandparents, who sort of sheepishly say, well, they don't say it. How can you say, oops,
Yes.
Sorry, we forced your mother to sign relinquishment papers. We wish we had helped support you. That's a pretty big mistake to admit, right?
Yeah.
It's a great question, but
Wow, what an amazing story. Well, Gabrielle, I wonder if you could reach back and show us the cover of the book. This is an amazing, and tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people buy it and follow you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's called American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. And you can buy it at you can find it at your independent booksellers. Of course, you can get it on Amazon. And you can find me at my website, GabrielleGlaser.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Gabrielle Glaser.
Gabrielle, what an amazing story. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to meet you. Thanks for having me on.